Hi, welcome to another episode of Science Literacy. I'm your host, Andy Epton, and today I'm going to open another can of worms. In this case, I'm going to be looking at climate change. At a previous episode, I opened the can of worms that is vaccines, and we may address vaccines again today, but the number one topic today is going to be climate change. And this is being um, brought to mind really because of obviously the West Coast is on fire. Let's just play it, say it what it is. The West Coast of the United States is on fire. Much like Australia was on fire earlier in the year, here in 2020, the West Coast is on fire. And obviously, this is not the first time the West Coast has been on fire, or at least California, but this fire particularly has had some incredible effects. One, it's turned the sky orange. Smoke from the fires has blown across the United States, extending as far as Washington D.C. Here in Michigan, where I live, a couple of nights ago, my family and I took a walk, and I turned around and saw the sun, and the sun was gorgeous. It was this big red disc in the sky, and I could look at it without sunglasses. I shouldn't be able to do that, and it shouldn't look like that. It was beautiful, but it was not an indication of something good. It was definitely a symptom of something that was absolutely not right. And again, those were the wildfires out west. Um, and the thing is, the fires, obviously the fires have different causes for what start the fires, but the underlying symptom or the underlying cause for it is of course climate change, because without climate change the droughts wouldn't be as bad as they are. Without climate change the trees would not be as dry as they are. Without climate change the heat would not be as oppressive as it is. And it just seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. Again, yes, California deals with climate change. Part of California is what we call a chaparral biome, which means it's supposed to be dry for a good portion of the year, and it has life forms, plant and animal, that are adapted to those particular environmental conditions. However, you can't keep having dry and more dry without something coming out of it as a consequence. And in this case, it is obviously the fires. So the problem, or the problem is climate change, obviously. uh, the thing is, a lot of people are dismissing the climate change aspect by basically blaming the fires on arson. Yes, same thing happened in Australia. People were setting the fires. That's not being argued. That's not at debate here. Yes, people are starting the fires. Nature is starting the fires, but the 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 fuel for the fire, the reason why the fire is as bad as it is obviously, or again, climate change. And unfortunately, our number one politician, our president, Donald Trump, and unfortunately, it has to be this way. I have to delve into this political aspect of things, and I'll explain it in just a minute why. But when he had a sit down recently with the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, and a director, I think, of natural resources there in California, and he was asked pointedly why he won't do anything about climate change, why he won't admit or accept the very prominent evidence that climate change is happening. And he said very flippantly that he thinks it's going to get cooler. It'll get cooler and it'll be all over. Very similar to the ridiculous statement on the pandemic back at the beginning that it'll just disappear one day. He thinks that one day the climate change will just disappear, and that's not how things work. It hasn't happened in the last 200 years. And it's certainly not going to happen overnight now, given that we have done almost nothing to mitigate it or to stop it. Um, it is going to continue to get worse. And he said the scientists, he's like, I don't think they know. They, don't think they know what? That climate change is happening or that climate change is going to get worse? Yeah, climate or scientists do know. Scientists have warned and written about this for decades, century and a half even. Back in the 1800s, John Tyndall and Svante Arrhenius, two scientists separated by country and time, we're talking decades apart, both hypothesized that increasing the rate of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to cause an increase in warming. We've known this since the 1800s, and yet we continue to spew out greenhouse gases at an alarming rate. And we act like this is a surprise, like, oh, wow, why is this happening? We know why this is happening. Scientists have been warning of this for decades now. And again, over a century, we've known about this. There's no excuse anymore. There really is no excuse. You can't pretend like you didn't know that this was happening. We can't pretend like that somehow the knowledge that carbon dioxide absorbs infrared radiation coming off of the earth from the sun, that would have no ill effect on our planet. So what is going on? What can we do about it, if anything? And some other things we're going to take a look at here. So, sorry, ear was itching. So, what is happening? Well, okay, so it's called the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is named for the very common understanding that the glass panes of a greenhouse absorb and trap infrared radiation. So the sun's light passes through the glass as visible light. It's absorbed by the earth, and then it's re-radiated by or as infrared, which is a longer wavelength than visible light. And so the glass panes, which were transparent to visible light, is opaque to infrared. And so the infrared cannot pass out through the glass panes. It's trapped in that house, a greenhouse, because that's where we can grow plants year round, tropical plants even, in places like England. So the greenhouse effect is a planet-wide version of this. Carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, as well as water vapor and methane, serve as the glass panes. So visible light comes through, is absorbed by our planet during the day, and is re-radiated as infrared light. Carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane absorb that infrared and then transmit it back to the surface so that the surface heats up as a result. Without the greenhouse effect, we would be dead. The average temperature of the Earth without the greenhouse effect, I think, is about minus 18 Fahrenheit. The average temperature with the greenhouse effect is about 56 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is average temperature globally for over a year. So over the course of a year, for the entire planet, poles, equator, desert, glacier, winter, summer, the average temperature is 56 degrees with the greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect keeps us alive. It keeps our plants alive. It keeps our animals alive. It allows us to actually function. Otherwise, we'd freeze to death all the time. So the greenhouse effect is good. However, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And that's what we're experiencing because we're increasing that rate of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the concentration of it. Carbon dioxide makes up a very tiny percentage of the overall composition of our atmosphere. It's 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 0.9% argon, and 0.1% is of our atmosphere is made up of water vapor, methane, carbon dioxide, ozone, um, ammonia, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, um, sulfur dioxide, all sorts of other things. Carbon dioxide makes up, I think, 0.03% of the overall composition of our atmosphere. And that number alone makes it seem like it's so infinitesimally small that it's as to be, useless or pointless to even worry about it. But that's not the case. That little bitty tiny amount of carbon dioxide is spread out over the entire planet. And that amount absorbs the infrared light coming out of the earth and transmits it back to the surface along with methane and water vapor. So that's keeping us as we are, but we're adding to the carbon dioxide. We're increasing that amount by burning fossil fuels. Carbon that was stored in the planet or stored in the ground, taken out of circulation of the carbon cycle. Yes, that's a thing, similar to the water cycle. This carbon was locked up underground when plants and trees and other photosynthetic organisms died 300 plus million years ago and were buried in the ground. And that locked that carbon up. It took it out of circulation. And so the planet resumed and adapted to the carbon that was left over, carbon coming from volcanoes, carbon coming from the decay of other organisms, and it made use of that. And that was the cycle. But in the, you know, shoot, thousands of years ago, but until fairly recently, really is when it started taking off. So 1600s, 1700s, when we started burning coal in abundance, we took that carbon that had been taken out of circulation and now we're putting it back into circulation. Meanwhile, the planet is operating basically at capacity. It's using the carbon, circulating the carbon through the atmosphere, through the oceans, through the land, through the organisms. And suddenly here's this influx of carbon in addition to the carbon that was already out there. It's like printing new money that actually is not, because this isn't new money. This is old money that was just locked away for millions of years. So the carbon content of the atmosphere has increased quite rapidly over the last 200 years. It has spiked. And what we're seeing as a result is a temperature spike correlating to that carbon spike. So the spike increases rapidly. And again, we've known this. We've known this since the 1800s, that this is a possibility and that this could happen. So again, we can't pretend like we didn't know. We knew. We just ignored it because getting rid of the fossil fuels would have had a deleterious effect on obviously the economy and the industry of the world, because we've got to power our vehicles. We've got to power the electricity that we all use. And the cheapest method of doing that is fossil fuels. It's the easiest. You just light it on fire and off it goes. The problem is it creates carbon dioxide through the oxidation combustion reaction. So as it combusts, it combines with oxygen and it turns to CO2. So we have carbon dioxide entering the atmosphere from millions of years old carbon that was locked away and was out of circulation. Now we're putting it back and we wonder why this is suddenly a bad thing. There's a lot of myths, there's a lot of misunderstandings associated with climate change, and there's no way I'm going to be able to address all of them or even a fraction of them in a single episode, especially considering I want to just introduce the topic and then get to kind of what's happening today. We will come back to climate change, just like we'll come back to vaccines, just like we're going to come back and open up the next can of worms, evolution, some other day. But we will get to these. But right now, we need to focus on what's going on at the moment. So, climate change is increasing. Climate change has made the oceans warmer, setting off not necessarily more hurricanes, although right now in the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, it looks like they're a dime a dozen. The whole tropics area is completely filled with tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes. It's ridiculous. They're in all different stages of development, and they are headed toward our country, either from the Gulf of Mexico or from the Atlantic. It is utterly ridiculous. We just dealt with Laura hitting the Gulf Coast, where it devastated parts of Louisiana and Mississippi, dumping lots of water onto these little states that are in low-lying areas, and causing a lot of wind damage. But right now we have Sally just sitting off the coast in the Gulf, and that's even worse because even though Laura was bigger, it was a category 4 when it made landfall. Katrina was only a 3 when it made landfall, which is a misleading description. But those are the descriptions I have. Uh, Laura was technically more powerful than Katrina, but luckily it didn't hit in an area that caused widespread flooding in heavily populated areas. Plus, people evacuated as they're supposed to do. So I don't know of too many deaths associated with Laura right now compared to say Katrina. But Sally is nowhere close to the strength of Laura. The problem is it's just sitting. And we saw this in 2018 with Hurricane Florence on the East Coast, North Carolina. As Florence approached, it slowed down to the point where it stalled out right off the coast of North Carolina. And it just stayed there, dumping feet of water onto those coastal communities, completely inundating them and separating them from the mainland or other parts of the mainland, really. Even though it was considered, I think, a category 2 or category 3, it wasn't a severe hurricane. The way it behaved was unlike any other hurricane that I am familiar with. Now, granted, I've only been on this planet for 40 years and really paid much attention to hurricanes within the last, say, 20 years. Because prior to that, I lived my entire life in the mountains of South Carolina, essentially. So I didn't have to deal with hurricanes. However, I became more interested as I got more interested in the earth as a whole subject. And so, yeah, Florence was something unlike anything that I was familiar with. It just stalled out and just dumped feet of rain. I mean, it was ridiculous the amount of rain it dumped onto that area. Prior to that, the year before, we had Harvey that dumped so much water onto the Houston area, it actually depressed the crust of the earth, fraction of an inch, but still, it made the earth's crust depress or sink due to the weight of water. That's how much water was dumped on it. And yet, we look at hurricanes based on their wind speeds. We need to look at them based on the potential rainfall and storm surges. However, all of that aside, the hurricanes aren't necessarily becoming more numerous, they're becoming worse. So the ones that we do experience are stronger. They don't behave the way that normal hurricanes behave. So most hurricanes would essentially hit and move up and lose energy and dissipate. These things are hitting, moving back, getting bigger, and coming back again, or they're stalling out, or they're just so monstrous that they hit an incredibly large area. That's becoming more and more frequent. At what point do we say, okay, we've had 5 years straight of monster hurricanes or widespread flooding from hurricanes, more so than we've had in the previous 2 decades or something like that. When do we say that is a trend? Do we continue pointing at it and go, well, that's a fluke, wait till next year, it may not do that? Because if we keep waiting until we have mountains of data, decades of experience, it's too late, because we could have used that information and made the necessary precautions decades before when it actually would have mattered for some people. So we need to be aware of the climate change situation and how it's affecting our planet, not just in terms of forest fires, but in terms of, again, the hurricanes and the risk they pose to the lower lying communities. Add to that the sea level rises that is happening due to melting ice caps. The Greenland ice sheet is melting at an alarming rate. The Antarctic ice sheets are melting at incredible rates as well. They're melting from below and they're melting from above, creating a just absolute disaster waiting to happen as the oceans continue to rise, because hot water also expands and thus rises. So we're seeing rising waters, not just due to ocean melt, or ice melt, but also rising waters due to expansion of the water due to its heat. We're heating up the oceans. We're heating up the ice. We're heating up our forests. We're heating up our farms as well. We are destroying this planet because we insist on continuing to use fossil fuels. Now, we could go and maybe use renewable energy sources. Renewable energy sources would be great, except we need governmental help for this, because currently the government, we talk about free market, especially here in the United States. We talk about free market. Let the free market decide. Well, what is being missed out is that the oil industry and the coal industry are both being propped up by governmental subsidies. So it's not a free market. We're keeping the prices of those particular commodities low. Meanwhile, when we had tried to prop up or at least boost solar production, it floundered because the government removed those subsidies because they turned it into a campaign of, we're using taxpayer dollars to pay for solar. Yeah, they did actually. But you know what? We're using taxpayer dollars to pay for oil and coal. We're boosting up those particular industries, which are dying industries, especially coal. Coal is a dying industry. They're using fewer people and still getting the same amount of coal out. So they're never going to hire more people. That's not going to happen, because they can use machines to do the job of people, and they don't have to pay machines. They don't have to pay liability insurance on machines. They don't have to pay health insurance for machines. They don't have to pay death benefits for machines. So that's the way the coal industry is going. They're losing people, and they're going to continue to lose people as technology increases in that industry. And it's going to keep doing so because it's safer and easier to use a machine to do a job than it is to use a human. So the coal industry is never going to be what it was. Unfortunately, those people are going to have to find other jobs. But this has happened before in the past. We've had so many other industries that have died due to increased technology, and we have changed with those times. The coal industry just has to do this. And so this is where that whole political and science runs together. So science is often told to stay out of politics. Stay out of politics. Scientists need to know stay in their lane, know your role, do your jobs, just stick to science. I'm a teacher, I'm an educator, I'm not an expert in this. I'm just a science communicator. I'm often told, keep politics out of your classroom, keep politics out of your subject. And you know what? That's fantastic advice. The problem is, the politics doesn't stay out of my classroom, because they enter my classroom when they make decisions that affect my classroom. They make decisions based on, or that affect the environment, and I teach environmental science. So how can I keep from talking about politics? How can I keep from talking about a dying coal industry that is being propped up by the government, paying government or subsidies, taxpayer dollars to keep people in a job that is causing widespread pollution and climate change? How can I keep politics out of it when our president goes on national TV and flatly denies climate change and talks very poorly or even incredibly errantly of climate change? Says things that are just so wrong that I would fail a student if they tried to come up, or if they tried to present that as a final project of, hey, what's climate change? Explain it. And they said, oh, it's just going to get better. It's just going to go away. Without any evidence whatsoever, it's going to go away. I'm sorry, that's just not good. That you can't do that. So as long as they keep entering my arena, I'm going to keep bringing them into mine as well. I'm going to keep correcting their mistakes or correcting their gaps, correcting their misinformation, because I do not want my students to go out into the world and go, hey, guess what? Climate change is going to go away someday, because it's not going to go away. And if it does go away, it's not going to be because we keep burning coal, or because we keep burning oil, or because we keep burning natural gas, or because we have keep going as business as usual. It's going to be because we have fundamentally changed the entire structure of our society and economy. Then, and only then, may climate change start to actually wane. But you know what? It's possible that we're at a point where there is no hope, in the sense of it's going to get better, or it's going to actually reverse trend. We might be in such a situation right now because we hemmed and hawed and waited for so long for more and more and more data, when we had the data and when we could have done something about it. But because we ask for more, but because they demand more, let's wait for more data. We don't have all the information. Guess what? We're never going to have all the information. We don't have all the information on anything before we make decisions, because there's always something left to be known. So because we waited, because we have hemmed and hawed, because we wanted more and more and more data, and because the data just kept showing things are getting worse and worse and worse, we may be at that point where we cannot reverse the trend. We just may have to make it as best as possible. One of those things where things are going to get bad, but we can keep them from getting worse. We already accept they're going to get bad. We're going to have extinctions. We're going to have forest fires. We're going to have flooding. We're going to have um, stronger hurricanes and stronger tornadoes and stronger storms. We're going to have blizzards like the likes of which we've never experienced before. As the polar vortex destabilizes and drops down into the lower 48 states and causes widespread frostbite for anybody caught outside. That happened a few years ago. I know because my in-laws were living in Michigan, and I was down in Virginia, and they were being told not to go outside for any more than 5 minutes because of potential frostbite. That's how cold it was. It does not get that cold here, usually, at least not where they live, in kind of the in the thumb part of the mitten, somewhere in this area here of Michigan. So it doesn't usually get that cold, but yet there they were being told not to go outside because the polar vortex came down and basically dropped temperatures to minus 35 degrees. That's not normal. That's not something that we should go, oh, well, that's going to offset climate change. No, that's because of climate change. It destabilized that polar vortex and caused it to drop down farther than it usually does. So we're going to keep seeing this. The best we can hope for right now is that we make it not as bad. We keep it from getting so much worse that we see even more flooding, even more extinctions, even more famine, even more drought. We can try to rein in this tide of devastation and keep it from getting worse. But in order to do that, we have to be willing to have that conversation of, okay, what sacrifices can we make? What sacrifices can I make? Is climate change real? Absolutely. Do scientists know? Yes, they do. Are the wildfires in Oregon, in California, and Washington caused by climate change? Yes. Is it caused by arson? Yes. But it's being made worse by climate change. Are the hurricanes in the Gulf, in the Atlantic, getting worse? Yes. Is it because of climate change? Yes. Because the oceans are warming up and hurricanes feed off of warm ocean water. Warm, hot ocean water supercharges these storms. Are famines and droughts getting worse? Yes. Is it caused by climate change? Yes. Is it only the United States that deals with this? No. The whole world deals with this, but we're the only country that continually and bewilderingly sticks our head in the sand and pretends like this isn't a thing, or pretends that it's going to hurt the world's economy if we actually try to do something. Other countries are trying to do something. We're still using the same trope that we used back in 1998 with the Kyoto Protocol, when China and India were not involved because they were developing countries. We're still pointing the fingers at them. There are those out there that are still going, well, what about China and India? China is now leading the world in solar production. Explain that. If they're not doing anything, they're doing something. They passed us by a long time ago. We're still playing with our oil toys in the sand, really. And they've gone on to college. They've gone on and they're moving on to bigger and better things. Are they still producing tons of pollution? Yes, they are. That hasn't changed really, except they've also invested a lot in alternative and renewable energy sources, far more than we ever did or have. So something's got to change. We cannot have the leader of our country pretending like this isn't a thing or even downplaying it. This is a long term beast that just is not going to go away because we're still feeding it. Okay. You can't keep throwing food outside and expecting the stray animals to go away. That's what we're doing. We're feeding it with our constant greenhouse gas emissions, and it's not going to go away. We need to do something. All right, so that's 30 minutes, actually 31 minutes. I opened the can of worms, so we'll see where we go from here. Um, Next episode, who knows what will come up. Again, I try to follow the date, the events of the day, or whatever happens to be kind of fresh in my mind, and go from there. So, again, I'm your host, Andy Epton. That's it for science literacy, because science.